Hi everyone. Today let's try to understand about Azure disks. Disks are primarily used for the virtual machines to store the data. So there are different types of disk where a virtual machine will use. We have a OS disk, we have a temporary disk, and we have a data disk. And here let's try to understand what is the use of an OS disk and what is the use of a da- data disk and what is the use of a temporary disk, and then we'll be jumping into the disk concepts. So when we talk about Azure managed disks, we have one of the major concepts to be understood and be prepared while we are actually handling any task related to managed disks or related to an interview. So let's jump into it and understand what does an OS disk and what does a data disk and what does a temporary disk mean. So when we talk about OS disk means that the primarily the OS of a virtual machine will be data will be stored in the OS disk, and even this disk can be utilized for uh, storing the application, any specific workload data and all that. But we don't use this application data to be stored in OS disk. The reason is because if the VMs can be corrupted or VMs can be not functional because of few reasons. And that point of time, when we wanted the disk, the data and all that, we might not be in a position to access it because it is primarily the OS disk is nothing but the main functionality of the virtual machine for to access data. And when we are not able to log in, we will not be able to access the OS disk. That's how it works. To kind of remove this kind of situation, we use data disk, so that data disk is an actually it will help in terms of persisting the data from the workloads into this disk, and you can detach this disk from a virtual machine and attach that disk to another virtual machine. So if I can actually link this one disk data disk to one virtual machine, and after I storing the data and everything, I can choose to detach the disk and attach the same disk to another virtual machine, or I can actually create multiple disks from this disk and attach that disks to the other virtual machines. We have another concepts where like shared disk pool, shared disks, but not at this point of time. We are addressing those things. What I wanted to say is using Azure managed disk, we are actually for a virtual machine, we could actually see three types, and that is a temporary disk, OS disk, and a data disk. And OS disk, as I said, it's primarily for the OS, and that's the reason why when we say OS disk, we actually choose premium SKU or premium performance for the OS, because more better is the OS disk in terms of premium features and everything. The most faster and read and write operations which can happen between the OS, or the performance of the OS in terms of making the other processes to work accordingly will be more efficient and more optimal. And that kind of situation, that's why it's always recommended to have a premium SKU OS disk. So in there are in when we go into specifically about disks, managed disk, we have one concept called SKU. There is a premium SSD, and there is an what do you say, there is standard HDD, and there is a premium HDD and premium standard SSD. So the use of SSD is it provides better IOPS compared to an HDD, but obviously it's costlier. So that's the reason why for OS disks we choose a premium SSD, and for the data disks we can prefer to use a standard SSD or a standard HDD. Or if cost was not an issue in terms and optimize the performance is a major criteria, then we can prefer even for data disks a premium SSD. What is the difference between the SKUs? More is about the IOPS than the throughput. There are two concepts which related to a storage point of view. One is IOPS and one is throughput. I already have dealt this one in the storage fundamentals. If you can refer the playlist called Learn AZ104 and 900, and in that, in the storage basics, I have already explained about what is an IOPS and what is throughput. But let me actually give it in one line. IOPS is actually the input and output operations per second, which can happen between the disk and the process or the other machine. Now, similarly, between the throughput is the amount of capacity of data which can be flowing in and out is all the throughput. Okay, so just not number of the operations, but equally the amount of throughput should be the equal criteria. So both will be more efficient in terms of an SSD compared to a HDD, but obviously SSD is more costlier compared to HDD, because when we have workloads, we don't have a single virtual machine. We'll have multiple virtual machines, so we'll end up having lot of managed disks, and a lot of data will be generated. So we have to be very conscious in terms of the way we are preferring the service storage services, because if it is crossing some terabytes of data, you will be charged per month some lakhs or crores of rupees accordingly. So just prefer in terms of choosing a better performance in terms of cost optimization and everything. Now let's jump into further understanding the other concepts. So in temporary disks, what is the we'll store the temporary the data whichever which will not be stored in the OS and data disks, which for the processes eventually to run for some period of time and everything. The data which has to be stored will be stored in temporary disk, and that point of time, if the virtual machine has been stopped and shut down and restarted or something, we lose whatever data which is residing in the temporary disk. And that's the reason why even in application workloads, we will not store the data in temporary disk. So your questions would be coming in this way, which if I would actually prefer a better SKU performance and everything, which I will try to prefer a better performance queue. Is it for an OS disk or a data disk? Data disk is where the application data will be stored. Now you can say that if at all for OS disk mandatorily, it's not mandatorily, it's the most preferred option is the premium SSD. The reason is because of more optimal performance or higher performance in terms of the process and the OS disk. And similarly, when we talk about data disks, if the application workload main criteria is performance, then we'll still prefer premium SSD. Otherwise, we can even still prefer a standard SSD or a standard HDD as an option. But we would recommend, if at all the cost is an actually point of view, then we can recommend standard HDD. So this is how you can actually say, and or you have to understand this is how we actually have to think in terms of cost optimization plus which disk we have to prefer. And next thing is, what happens if the data is there in temporary disk? Is it recommended to store data in temporary disk? We can store, but it's not at all recommended to store the application workloads or critical data in temporary disk. The reason is because if at all the virtual machines have restarted or shut down and we have started, the temporary disk data will be all erased. So this is how we have to look at it. And let's understand the next concepts in the Azure disk. So we have encryption. So in terms of encryption, there are two types of encryptions which we can see for a managed disk. One is server-side encryption and one is Azure disk encryption. The other one is server-side encryption. So in server-side encryption, we have three things. One is platform managed encryption, one is customer managed encryption, one is uh, what do you say, double encryption. So what is platform managed? The encryption will be whenever the data is being stored in the disk, the data will be encrypted by Microsoft itself using platform managed keys. They'll have their own encryption keys. Now, if you are saying customer managed encryption, then they will encrypt the data which is being stored in the Azure disks using your own keys, which you are bringing your encryption keys, and that you will keep it in and key vault, and you will provide the key vault URI and everything. Now there's a double encryption, which is encrypting with data which is being stored using both of these keys, platform managed keys and customer managed keys. And the other one which we can actually hear is the encryption at host. Even the data, just not the data when it's being stored, at where it is being stored, even that one, the physical hardware, that one also be encrypted. That's called encryption at host. Now, what is Azure Disk Encryption? Then end-to-end encryption in terms of for Linux machines, we have decrypt and everything. So uh, for this one you have to enable, if you wanted to choose to for a virtual machine to specifically encrypt data disk or OS disk or temporary disk or all the disks accordingly, you can use Azure Disk Encryption to ensure this facility is being feature is being utilized. And what is attach and detach? The next further concepts in managed disk is how do we attach a disk and how do we detach the disk? How do we ensure that the after we attaching it to an index machine or a Windows machine, how do we access and store the data, and how do we detach that, and how do we store the access that from another virtual machine? So these concepts you have to be aware of while you're trying to learn about Azure Disk. And let's understand about backup. When we're talking about backup, there is we can backup our disk using snapshot or using the other option called backup vault. So if there is another fee, service in Azure which is backup vault, which will help us in actually backing up the Azure disks, managed disk. And along with it, we can actually ensure that right now itself we can create a backup for a disk using a snapshot. And snapshot, as the naming convention says, is just an image of that data. And because of all these factors, snapshot will be obviously costless. It will be a more in terms of if you have a disk and you just need to keep a backup of it, then you can keep a backup of it. But you have something, an option of every 1 week you need to take a backup or a daily a backup, then you can prefer a backup vault to actually perform the backup options. And when we talk about performance, as I mentioned, there are three types of SKUs. One is a premium SKU, one is a standard SSD, premium SSD, standard SSD, and a standard HDD. What does an HDD is? Hard disk drive, and SSD is solid state drive. And SSD will have more IOPS and throughput. When I say IOPS and throughput, IOPS says that number of input and output operations per second. Throughput means that amount of capacity which has to be flowing in and out of this is the data capacity. That's called the performance. And backup, we term it as in terms of taking a backup for the disks and everything. So this is how we have to look at it. And in terms of Azure Disk, and when you're trying to learn the major concepts which you have to be focusing on is attach and detach equally. How do we attach a disk to a Linux machine? How do we attach a disk to a Windows machine? Just because you attached this disk from the Azure portal or from PowerShell doesn't mean that you can store the data. For Linux machines, you have to mount the data. When you're trying to mount the data, if it is an empty disk, how do we actually ensure we can store files in it? If it's not having, it's already having a file system, how do we take care of it? So we have to look at all the different angles in terms of ensuring that when you attach a disk and you wanted to store files and detach that disk and access the same data from another virtual machine, then you have to again attach that similar disk. Or similarly, you also have to understand like there is one disk which is accessed by one virtual machine. Now this disk, whatever data is being stored in this, should be available for the other virtual machines also. Then you can actually create a snapshot of the disk, and from the snapshot you can create multiple disks. So this when you take a snapshot of a disk, this disk will be still available and be accessed by this VM. Or you can even detach this disk and attach it to another disk. But if you wanted in a scenario where the similar data has to be appeared in other virtual machines, you can actually ensure that this can be a shared disk. Or the other preferred option is make a take a snapshot of the disk and create multiple data disks and attach that each data disk to each virtual machine, and you will be in a position to access the similar data. But if you have to do this every time a consistent performance, then more preferred option is a shared disk, but it has its limitations in terms of sharing to number of accessing the one disk by number of virtual machines simultaneously. So this is about Azure Disk, and let me know if you have any questions or comments. Thank you.